The first thing they noticed was the silence, not the kind that follows gunfire or orders, but the strange, humming quiet of refrigeration. A low, steady vibration beneath the tile floor, mixed with the faint clatter of glass bottles and the rustle of paper bags. When the Japanese prisoners stepped through the automatic doors, they froze. The air was cold, clean, almost sweet. Rows upon rows of food stretched into the distance, fruit so bright it looked painted, meat packed in ice, bread stacked higher than helmets in an armory. Above it all, a fluorescent light hummed like a living thing. For men who had once starved on rice balls and boiled weeds, it felt like stepping into another planet. One soldier whispered, "Is this America's temple?" Another shook his head. "No, it's a market." He didn't believe it. None of them did. Because every lesson they'd ever been taught about the decaying West, the weak and lazy Americans, the empire destined to fall, collapsed right there, between the aisles of canned peaches and soap. A guard leaned against his cart, amused. "Go ahead," he said softly. "You can touch it." The prisoner hesitated, then reached for a loaf of bread. It yielded under his fingers, soft and warm. He pulled back his hand as if burned. In that moment, the war was over in a way it had never been on the battlefield. For the first time, they realized America hadn't just won with bombs. It had won with refrigerators. He looked around, the light, the laughter, the sound of coins at the register, and muttered almost to himself, "The Americans must be lying to us. No nation could possess such abundance." But they weren't lying. And what they were about to see next would shatter everything they thought they knew. They had grown up believing America was a wasteland, fat men in torn clothes, women who drank, children who disobeyed. Every poster, every radio broadcast in Japan had painted the same picture, a dying culture of greed and chaos. The emperor's soldiers were the chosen few, pure in spirit, ready to cleanse the world. But when they arrived, the world didn't match the story. The guards who escorted them off the train smiled. The nurses who took their names offered water. On the way to the camp, they passed fields of wheat that rolled endlessly, dotted with machines that moved on their own. One of the men, Saito, a mechanic before the war, leaned close to the window and whispered, "We were told they couldn't even feed themselves." That lie began to crumble fast. At the camp, every prisoner received clean clothes, soap, a toothbrush, and 3 meals a day. The rice was white. The soup had meat. Meat. He stared at it as though it might disappear. That night, under the dim lights of the barracks, a young soldier named Harada confessed quietly, "Back home, my mother said the Americans ate their prisoners." Another man laughed, shaking his head. "If that's true," he said, "then we must taste like kings." The room went silent, but not from fear, something else. It was the beginning of doubt. They lay awake, listening to the hum of the generator outside, watching the electric bulb glow through the thin walls. It burned all night, never flickering. They didn't understand how. They didn't understand why. All they knew was that the darkness they had believed in wasn't out there anymore. It was inside them, unraveling thread by thread. And when dawn came, they would learn the first of many truths their homeland had hidden. Because what they were about to see next wasn't a rumor. It was a ship built in 4 days. They lined up outside the mess hall, the morning air sharp with the smell of yeast and burnt metal. Inside, American cooks moved with military precision, hands gloved, sleeves rolled, laughter mixing with the hiss of steam. On the counter sat trays of food so alien, it might as well have been treasure. Eggs, butter, and bread. Not just bread. White bread. Saito stared at the slice on his tray, pale as snow, soft as air. In Japan, bread was a rarity reserved for hospitals and foreigners. During the war, even rice had become a memory. They had ground chestnuts, weeds, and acorns into powder just to fill their stomachs. But this This was bread that seemed too pure to be real. He lifted it to his nose. The smell was warm, faintly sweet. Around him, the other prisoners hesitated, unsure if it was a test, a trick, or some strange humiliation. A guard noticed their confusion and chuckled. "Go on," he said. "It's for you." The first bite was soft enough to dissolve on the tongue. Butter melted into it, leaving a taste of salt and cream that no one could describe. One man closed his eyes. Another laughed, short and bitter. For us, this was victory. Saito would later write, "Not the bombs, not the guns. This bread, because it meant they could feed even their enemies." He looked around the hall. The guards ate the same meal, shoulder to shoulder with cooks and clerks. No one shouted. No one bowed. No one feared hunger. The prisoners finished in silence, each lost in thought. A few slipped pieces of crust into their pockets, not to hoard, but to prove to themselves that it was real. Outside, the smell of baking still lingered in the wind, faint and haunting. And as they walked back to their barracks, one of them whispered, "If this is breakfast, what does their war look like?" They were about to find out, on a ship that seemed impossible even to imagine. The first time they saw it, they thought it was a mirage. A gray mountain of steel rising from the water, cranes swinging above it like mechanical giants, sparks flying in every direction. The air was thick with the smell of oil and molten metal. A sign near the dock read, "SS Robert E. Peary, built in 4 days." 4 days. Saito counted on his fingers, whispering in disbelief. He had once spent 6 months assembling a single torpedo boat back in Yokosuka. Every rivet was hand-drilled, every joint checked by eye. Yet here, women with scarves over their hair guided welding torches faster than his entire crew could hammer a plate. A foreman noticed the group of POWs watching from behind the fence. "That one's already sailing." He shouted proudly, pointing to a ship easing down the slipway, fresh paint still gleaming. "Next one starts tonight." The Japanese men exchanged looks that bordered on fear. It wasn't arrogance they saw, it was rhythm. The whole dock moved like a living organism, trucks unloading steel, welders sparking in perfect tempo, sirens marking the next shift. No shouting, no chaos, just speed. One of them whispered, "They build ships like we build prayers." Another murmured, "Then our gods have already lost." Saito felt something twist in his chest, all those speeches about divine destiny and unbreakable spirit. Yet here, in this noisy American shipyard, the war was being decided not by courage, but by clocks. When the siren blew for lunch, he watched workers sit together, black, white, women, men, all opening their lunchboxes as one. No ranks, no bows, no slogans, just sandwiches and laughter under the cranes. He turned to the interpreter beside him. "How many ships can they make like this?" The man hesitated, then said quietly, "Hundreds, maybe thousands." Saito didn't answer. He just stared at the ship gliding toward open sea, still disbelieving. Because if they could build one in 4 days, what else were they capable of? And that night when darkness fell, he learned the next shock, in America. The night never truly came. The train rolled into San Francisco just after dusk, or at least that's what the clock said. Outside, it looked like noon. From the window, the prisoners saw the bay glittering like molten glass, bridges strung with lights that seemed to float in midair, streets alive with glowing signs that pulsed in color. The city didn't sleep. It burned quietly, beautifully. Saito pressed his hand against the glass. "It's night," he whispered. "Why is it still bright?" The guard beside him smiled. "Because here, darkness is optional." That answer hit harder than any bullet. For men who had grown up fearing the blackout sirens, who had painted windows black and whispered through candlelight, the idea that light could be endless, bought, controlled, summoned by a switch, felt like magic. But it wasn't magic. It was power. As the train slowed near the pier, he saw warehouses blazing with lamps, men unloading crates as if time no longer existed. Electricity ran through cables thicker than his wrist, feeding the hunger of a city that refused to rest. In Tokyo, lights were rationed. A single bulb hung over entire neighborhoods. Yet here, light spilled into every alley, every diner, every window. Proof that America had more energy than Japan could imagine. A younger soldier leaned forward, eyes wide. Do they not fear waste? Saito didn't answer, because in that moment, he realized something terrifying. America could afford to waste. They had so much that waste itself had become a symbol of victory. When the train finally stopped, he stepped onto the platform, blinking against the glow of the street lamps. He felt small, like a ghost from another century, wandering through a world that no longer needed the sun. He looked up. Neon lights spelled words he couldn't read, and beyond them, stars, faint, almost invisible, drowned by man-made light. In that blinding night, the prisoners understood something profound. Their empire had fought in darkness, while their enemy had learned to own the day and the night. But the real shock came the next morning, when they tasted the sweetness of peace for the first time, bottled in glass and capped in red. The bottles clinked like wind chimes when the guard opened the crate. Inside, dark glass caught the sun, each label a perfect red circle, Coca-Cola. The prisoners didn't know what to make of it. They'd seen the word on propaganda leaflets dropped from planes, painted over with sneers about American corruption, but now sweating in the July heat. They were each handed one of those mythical bottles, cold enough to mist in their hands. Saito turned it over carefully, watching bubbles rise like tiny pearls. A hiss escaped as he twisted the cap, followed by a sharp, sweet scent he couldn't name. He lifted it to his lips. The first taste exploded. Sugar, smoke, something like burnt caramel. It was absurdly good. So good it felt wrong. The others laughed as they drank, a few coughing at the fizz. One said it was like swallowing stars. Another compared it to medicine for the soul. Then came the ice cream, bowls of it, white and smooth, handed out as if this were a summer festival instead of a prison camp. The cold bit into their teeth. The sweetness pulled something loose inside their chests. One man whispered, "We fought monsters, and they make food like this?" Across the yard, the guards lounged in the shade, smoking, joking, offering seconds. No malice, no lectures, just generosity. For years they had been told America was a dying nation, rotted by greed. But here was proof of life. Vivid, loud, and merciful. The prisoners realized with a jolt that this sweetness wasn't just flavor. It was confidence. It was civilization itself. Later in his diary, Saito would write, "We built an empire on fear. They built one on ice and laughter." And the next day, they boarded a train that would take them deeper into that empire, into a world where even prisoners were treated like guests. The whistle blew, low and steady, and the train began to move. Not the freight cars they expected, not the wooden boxes they had been crammed into during the war, but a Pullman carriage, polished wood, soft seats, clean curtains that fluttered in the breeze. The air smelled faintly of coffee and linen, not sweat or gun oil. When the prisoners entered, they hesitated, unsure if they were walking into a trap or a theater. Each seat had a pillow. Each window had glass so clear it made the fields outside look painted. A porter in a crisp white jacket appeared, smiling. "Coffee? Tea?" The words hit them like bullets. One of the men laughed nervously. Another simply stared, hands shaking as he accepted a steaming mug. The porter bowed slightly, not mockingly, but as if these uniformed strangers were just travelers passing through. As the train rolled across the Midwest, the landscape unfolded like a promise. Endless farms, silver silos, roads filled with cars, a world untouched by hunger. Saito watched through the window. remembering the bombed ruins of Yokohama, the smell of burning tatami mats, the faces of children with nothing to eat. Now here he was, a defeated soldier, being served breakfast on a train with lace napkins. A small detail broke him. A waitress, maybe 19, refilled his cup without looking afraid. Her hair was golden, her voice calm. He looked down at his reflection in the coffee's dark surface and whispered, "If this is how they treat prisoners, how do they treat their own?" Later in his diary, he wrote only one line: "Luxury does not humiliate, it teaches." When the train stopped that evening, he stepped off lighter somehow, not in body, but in belief. Yet the next place they were taken would strip away even that thin shield of comfort, because there, behind hospital walls, they would witness the enemy's greatest weapon, mercy. The smell of antiseptic hit first, sharp, clean, merciless. It reminded Saito of field hospitals in Burma, except those had been filled with screams and flies. This one was silent. He followed a guard down a white corridor, polished to a mirror shine. Every door they passed was labeled neatly. Every nurse moved like part of a machine that never broke rhythm. When they reached the ward, he stopped short. There were prisoners inside, Japanese, German, even Italian, each lying on a crisp bed, hooked to humming machines that breathed for them. A doctor in khaki sleeves rolled up approached. His badge read, "Lentawonder Daniel Brooks, MMD." He smiled. Not the forced kind, but something genuine. "You were hit in the shoulder, right? Let's take a look." Saito froze. In his world, an enemy's wound was a mark of shame. In this one, it was a reason to help. Brooks spoke calmly as he cleaned the wound, explaining the new medicine he'd use. "Penicillin," he said, holding up a small vial. "You're lucky. It saves more lives than bullets can take." He injected it gently. The sting was brief, the warmth immediate. Saito looked away and saw another man, a sergeant from Hiroshima, being examined with a machine that flashed light through his chest. "X-ray," someone whispered. He could see his bones on a screen. It felt like sorcery. And yet, the Americans used it for prisoners. One nurse adjusted his pillow, smiling faintly. "You'll be fine," she said. He wanted to ask why. Why waste medicine on an enemy? Why show kindness to those who'd been taught to die rather than surrender? But the words never came. When he left, the doctor handed him a clean bandage and said quietly, "Pain doesn't wear a uniform." That sentence followed him out the door, heavier than his wound. That night he couldn't sleep, not from pain, but from confusion, because if even their enemies refused to hate them, what had all the killing been for? And soon he would see where that unstoppable compassion came from. A factory that never slept, churning out machines faster than any army could destroy them. The air inside the factory vibrated with motion. Engines roared, pistons slammed, conveyor belts clattered like thunder. The Japanese prisoners stood behind a safety rail, staring at the metallic river flowing before them, one that turned raw steel into flight. A supervisor in goggles shouted above the noise, "Every 63 minutes, one plane." They thought he was joking, but then, as if on cue, a complete bomber emerged from the far end of the assembly line, wings gleaming, propellers spinning. Workers, men and women, old and young, cheered as it rolled past. Saito couldn't move. His mind kept counting, trying to understand. In Japan, one plane took months of labor, sweat, and prayer. Here, it was as routine as breathing. He watched a woman with a red scarf weld a panel into place, sparks dancing off her sleeve. She didn't flinch. She didn't even pause to look. "Every part comes from somewhere," the guide said proudly. "Tires from Ohio, engines from Detroit, glass from Illinois. Everything connected." That word, connected, stuck in Saito's head. Back home, connection meant obedience, a single mind controlling millions. Here, it meant cooperation. He watched an inspector test the cockpit switches. The man smiled, satisfied, and signed his name on the frame in chalk. Not an officer, just a worker. Yet that signature carried more pride than any military salute. Saito whispered to the man beside him, "How can they trust everyone to do this?" The interpreter answered softly, "They don't trust orders. They trust systems." The line never stopped. Lunch breaks came in shifts, so production never fell silent. It was as if the nation itself had become a machine, fed by faith, but not in God's. In progress. When the group left the factory, the sun was setting red over the smokestacks. Saito glanced back once more, watching another bomber glide into the sky. In his diary that night, he wrote, "They do not fight with swords or prayers. They fight with time." But the next shock would be quieter, colder, and somehow even more impossible. A warehouse full of food, frozen for a world that never starved. The warehouse door opened with a sound like thunder rolling across ice. Cold air poured out in waves, washing over the prisoners until their breath turned white. Inside, rows of steel shelves stretched farther than they could see, each one stacked high with boxes stamped U.S. Army, frozen rations. Saito stepped forward cautiously. A sergeant flipped a switch, and bright light flooded the space. Not yellow like oil lamps, but white, clean, and endless. Refrigeration units hummed in perfect rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat that filled the air. The interpreter whispered, "Everything in here is food." They walked between the aisles, stunned. Meat sealed in wax paper, milk in tin cans, vegetables still green, fish wrapped and frozen like it had just been caught. Saito reached for a package labeled steak, beef, prime, and his fingers numbed instantly. He pulled back, whispering, "They freeze time." The American officer guiding them grinned. "This feeds one base for a month. We've got hundreds more like it." Hundreds. In that single word was the weight of the empire's collapse. Japan couldn't feed its soldiers for a week without cutting rations. Here the enemy could feed nations and choose which to save. One of the prisoners murmured, "They built temples for food." Another corrected him softly, "No, they built temples for life." A forklift passed, carrying crates stamped with destinations: Hawaii, Panama, London. Even across oceans, America's appetite moved with precision. Saito felt something break in him, not anger, but awe. This wasn't excess. It was a kind of faith, the belief that hunger itself could be conquered. That night, as he wrote in his journal under the dim camp light, his hand trembled. We fought for honor. They fought for comfort. And somehow, comfort won. But he hadn't yet seen the true secret of that victory. The women who kept the engines of this empire alive. They expected to see soldiers. Instead, they saw women. The prisoners were marched through another factory, this one louder, brighter, alive with motion. Sparks rained down from scaffolds where women in denim coveralls welded steel ribs together. Others drove forklifts, packed ammunition, tested engines. Their hair was tied in red scarves, their sleeves rolled high, grease streaking their cheeks like war paint. Saito stopped mid-stride. Back home, women knelt behind paper screens, their voices barely above whispers. Here, they shouted across the floor, confident, direct, unafraid. One woman laughed as a man dropped a wrench, another barked, "Pick it up, soldier." And the room erupted with grins. An officer beside him said proudly, "While we fight, they build." It was not bravado, it was truth. America's home front had turned labor into battle, and these women, Rosie the Riveters, were its infantry. Posters of them hung on the walls, sleeves flexed, slogans bold. "We can do it." A prisoner whispered, "Our mothers prayed." theirs produce. Saito couldn't look away. He watched a woman weld a seam so perfect it gleamed like silver thread. She glanced up, caught his stare, and smiled. Not mockery, but something that felt like pity, or maybe pride. He looked down, ashamed and mesmerized at once. For the first time, he realized strength could wear a skirt and a smile. It didn't need a sword. Later, as they left, he asked the interpreter quietly, "What happens when the men return?" The man shrugged. "America doesn't go backward." That answer lingered. Because if even their women had learned to master steel and fire, what future could an empire of obedience possibly have? And yet, amid all that noise and pride, the next lesson would come not from factories, but from children's laughter echoing through a fence. The laughter came first, light, high, and startlingly free. The prisoners were working near the fence that day, stacking timber under the watch of a few unarmed guards when they heard it. Across the road, a group of American children were playing in a schoolyard. They chased a red ball through the grass, shouting and laughing, their voices cutting through the hum of trucks and cicadas. At first, the sound made the men uneasy. In Japan, children had been taught to bow to soldiers, to whisper the emperor's name like a prayer. But these children laughed in front of their enemies, laughed at the world itself. One boy noticed the men by the fence. He stopped, blinked, then waved. His friends followed, shouting, "Hi," in bright, fearless English. One of the guards waved back. To everyone's surprise, so did Saito. The children giggled and ran off again, the red ball bouncing into sunlight. For a long time afterward, the prisoners stood there silently. No one gave an order. No one barked at them to move. Later in the mess hall, one man muttered, "They raise their children without fear." Another replied, "That's why they can't be conquered." Saito didn't speak. He only remembered the sound, that laughter pure and unafraid, and felt something unravel inside him. It wasn't envy. It was grief for a childhood he'd never had, and for a country that had taught him to worship death instead of life. That night when the lights went out, he still heard those voices echoing in his head, small, bright, invincible. And soon another sound would haunt him even deeper. The silence that followed Hiroshima. The news came at dawn, whispered from guard to guard before it ever reached the prisoners. No one shouted. No one ran. It spread like a chill through the camp. Quiet, contagious, unreal. Hiroshima is gone. That was all anyone said. No planes, no invasion. Just a city. Erased. Saito sat on the edge of his bunk, the wooden floor trembling faintly beneath his feet, as if the earth itself refused to stay still. Around him, the others stared blankly at the walls. Someone asked, "How many?" No one answered. Another murmured, "A single bomb." And the silence that followed was worse than the words. A guard entered, his face pale. For once, his eyes didn't carry that easy American confidence. He didn't bark orders or smirk. He just stood there, hat in hand, and said softly, "Breakfast will be late." Then he turned and walked out. Outside, the camp felt heavier. Even the air seemed cautious. No birds, no wind, only the distant hum of a generator that suddenly felt obscene. Saito's mind raced through every map he knew. Hiroshima wasn't a military target. It was home. He thought of his sister who sold paper lanterns by the bridge. He thought of her hands, small and stained with ink. By afternoon, the guards had stopped talking. Some refused to meet their eyes. Others smoked in silence, staring into nothing. One young American guard, barely 20, muttered, "I didn't think it would do that." That night, no one in the camp could sleep. For the first time, the prisoners and their captors shared the same silence, not of hatred, but of horror. Saito wrote in his journal under the dim light of the barracks, "We thought the gods had turned their faces from us, but perhaps it was mankind who learned to make his own gods and burn them." He folded the paper and hid it beneath his mattress. There were no victors that night, only witnesses. But as the ashes of Hiroshima still drifted unseen across the Pacific, the prisoners would soon face another kind of revelation, one that showed how the Americans had truly seen through them, even in the dark. They saw it during what was supposed to be a morale lecture, an American officer showing educational films about how the war had been won. The prisoners sat on wooden benches in a dim hall, arms crossed, eyes wary. But when the reel flickered to life, silence fell. On screen, a single shell rose through the sky and exploded, not on impact, but in midair, perfectly above its target. The blast tore through the forest below like invisible fire. Then another, and another. The officer paused the projector. "Proximity fuse," he said. "A tiny radar in every shell. It knows when it's close enough to kill." A murmur rippled through the room. Radar? Inside a bullet? It was impossible. Even their best scientists in Tokyo had dismissed such a thing as fantasy. Yet here it was, on film, working with godlike precision. Saito felt his throat tighten. He remembered the months of praying to weather spirits before missions, the priests blessing bombs with incense, the belief that fate decided which man lived or died. And here on this screen was a different kind of fate, one written by engineers. When the lights came back on, the officer smiled faintly. "That's why your planes never came home." He said it without malice, just fact. Afterward, the prisoners filed out quietly. No one spoke for a long time. Outside, rain had begun to fall, pattering softly on the tin roof. Saito tilted his face upward, feeling each drop. Radar in a shell, gods in metal. He realized then that America hadn't just built better weapons, it had built better minds. That night, he wrote, "We thought faith could defy science, but science became their faith." And still the shocks weren't over. The next day, they would be shown something even more terrifying, a machine that could see the unseen, long before a single shot was fired. They brought them into a hangar that smelled of oil, ozone, and quiet triumph. At the far end stood a massive metal dish, turning with a slow, patient hum. Wires ran across the floor like veins, pulsing faintly with power. The American officer guiding the tour smiled. "Gentlemen," he said, "this is what saw you before you saw us." He flipped a switch. A green screen flickered to life. Small dots appeared, bright, steady pulses gliding across a circular field. Each one, he explained, is a plane, some hundreds of miles away. The prisoners leaned closer. The glowing dots moved in rhythm with the faint rotation of the dish. It was as if they were watching the invisible being made visible, like the gods themselves had lent these men their sight. Back in Japan, radar was rumor, a word whispered by scientists and dismissed by generals. Their armies relied on eyes, weather, and prayer. Yet here, in this cavern of machinery, the Americans had built a way to see through the dark itself. Saito felt his stomach twist. He remembered standing on the deck of a destroyer years ago, staring into black ocean, searching for silhouettes in the fog. He'd called it instinct. The Americans had called it data. The officer turned toward them, voice even. "With this, we knew when you'd come, where you'd strike. Sometimes, before you did." No arrogance, just quiet certainty. The kind that comes from knowing you've already won. Saito's hands trembled. This wasn't sorcery. It was clarity. They had fought with spirit. The Americans fought with understanding. He looked up at the radar screen again, its slow, hypnotic sweep washing across the green light. For the first time, he understood that true power wasn't noise or fire. It was knowledge. That night in his journal, he wrote, "They no longer pray for signs. They create them." But the revelation wouldn't end there. The next day, he would see what happened when knowledge met abundance, when even fuel, the blood of war, was treated as something disposable. The smell hit before they saw it. Gasoline, raw and endless, Miles of metal drums stretched across a flat plain, stacked like monuments to excess. Each one stamped with the same white letters, U.S. Army Fuel Reserve. The prisoners were told to stand back. A group of American engineers in dusty uniforms moved among the barrels, cutting holes, setting charges. One of them waved casually to a guard and shouted, "We're burning it all today." Saito blinked. "Burning?" he repeated through the interpreter. "Why burn it?" The guard shrugged. "Too expensive to ship home." The first explosion came moments later, a deep, muffled roar. Flames leapt skyward, twisting into black columns that clawed at the horizon. The heat rolled over them, staggering, like standing before the mouth of the sun. Barrels hissed and burst one by one, raining fire and smoke across the plain. Saito couldn't move. Every instinct screamed that this was madness. In Japan, men had died over a single tank of fuel. Pilots had flown suicide missions on fumes. Families had gone hungry so the army could fill one more truck. And here the enemy destroyed oceans of it just to clear the ground. One prisoner whispered, voice shaking, "They can afford to waste the world." But Saito saw something deeper. The Americans weren't celebrating. They burned quietly, methodically, as if purging ghosts. A strange sadness flickered in their eyes. Men who had seen abundance so vast it no longer meant anything. When it was over, the field was silent, except for the crackle of dying flames. Saito watched the smoke drift upward and thought, "This is how empires end, not in defeat, but in excess." That night he wrote, "They burned what we worshipped, and for the first time, I pitied them." But pity would soon turn to reflection, because in the days that followed, one letter, never sent, would mark the true beginning of his awakening. The letter began with her name, Aiko. He wrote it slowly, carefully, as if afraid the ink itself might tremble. It had been 3 years since he'd last seen her face, but her memory was still sharp. The way she stood by the window during the summer rains, the scent of soap on her hands, the small scar above her eyebrow from when the lamp had fallen. Now, sitting at a narrow desk in a quiet American barracks, Saito didn't know what to say. What words could a defeated soldier offer the wife of a ghost? He started anyway. "My dearest, I am alive, but the man you knew is gone." He told her about the ships built in days, the bread so soft it seemed impossible, the ice cream that tasted like forgiveness. He wrote of doctors who healed prisoners, and of children who waved instead of cursing. He wrote of light, so much light, and how he had begun to fear the darkness within himself more than the darkness around him. His pen paused often. Shame seeped through the ink. "They told us America was weak, but I have seen its strength, and it is not in weapons. It is in mercy." When he reached the part about Hiroshima, his hand stopped. He stared at the paper for a long time, then drew a single line through the word home. He couldn't bring himself to write the rest. The guard passed by, nodding politely. "Letter for Japan?" he asked. Saito folded the page carefully. "No," he said, "not yet." He slipped it into his pocket, knowing it would never leave the camp. Some truths were too heavy to send across an ocean. That night, he lay awake, listening to the wind rattle the barracks windows. The world he had fought for no longer existed, and the world he had feared was beginning to make sense. And in the morning, something in him changed forever. When he saw a former officer, once a fanatic, ask quietly for an English dictionary. It happened quietly, so quietly that the guards barely noticed. After roll call one morning, a former naval officer named Tanab, a man once known for his fiery patriotism and loud prayers to the emperor, approached the American interpreter. He bowed stiffly, eyes low, and said in careful English, "I wish to learn your language." The interpreter blinked, surprised. "English? Why?" Tanabe hesitated. "Because I want to understand what defeated me. The camp library was nothing more than a converted storage shed, lined with dog-eared novels and manuals. When Tanabe entered, the other prisoners watched from a distance. The man who once lectured them about dying for the emperor now ran his fingers reverently along the spines of English books. Mark Twain, Hemingway, the Federalist Papers. He didn't choose stories of war. He chose words. Saito followed him a few steps inside. On the table sat a small dictionary, its cover torn, the pages stained from years of use. Tanabe opened it as if it were scripture. He traced the letters slowly, whispering the sounds. Freedom, honor, truth. Those words, once weapons of propaganda, now felt like relics from a new world. In the evenings, Tanabe sat beneath the barracks light, copying words into a notebook. His pronunciation was rough, his grammar broken, but his determination was absolute. When others mocked him, he simply smiled. "If we cannot understand," he said softly, "we will repeat the same mistakes." One night, he looked up from his notes and met Saito's gaze. "We were never taught what freedom means," he said. "Perhaps it begins with listening." Saito nodded, feeling something stir deep within him. The empire that once spoke through orders and obedience was fading. A quieter empire, one of curiosity and humility, was beginning to rise from its ashes. By the next week, several men joined Tanabe. They practiced English together under the dim bulb, their voices hesitant but sincere. It wasn't rebellion, it was rebirth. And soon that quiet transformation would spread even further, on the day they were finally told they could go home, and found themselves bowing not to an emperor, but to the enemy who had shown them humanity. The morning they were told they would be released, no one cheered. The announcement came over the camp loudspeaker, flat, almost emotionless. Repatriation begins today. For a long while, the prisoners simply stood in place, unsure what freedom even meant anymore. The war had ended months ago, but inside the barbed wire, time had stopped. They gathered by the gate as trucks arrived to take them to the port. The guards, now more like escorts, handed out their belongings. A canteen, a jacket, a folded piece of paper stamped U.S. Army clearance. Before they left, an officer asked everyone to stand still. A record player was brought out, its needle trembling slightly as it found the groove. Then came the sound, slow, solemn, rising through the cool morning air. "Oh, say, can you see?" The American national anthem. The prisoners froze. No one moved. Some stared at the ground. Others looked toward the horizon. Saito kept his eyes forward. The melody was foreign, but the emotion, pride, sorrow, reverence, was unmistakable. It was the sound of a nation that had fought not just to win, but to remain itself. Without being told, several prisoners bowed their heads, not from fear, not from defeat, but from recognition. They were no longer soldiers. They were witnesses to something larger than power, dignity. When the song ended, there was no applause, only silence. A guard approached Saito and handed him a small paper bag. Inside was a sandwich, an apple, and a postcard of the Statue of Liberty. "For the journey," the man said simply. Saito took it with both hands. "Thank you," he murmured in halting English. The guard nodded once. "Take care, friend." As the trucks pulled away, Saito looked back at the camp one last time. The flag on the pole stirred gently in the wind. For the first time, he didn't see it as an enemy's banner. He saw it as a reminder that freedom wasn't a weapon to wield, but a light to share. And years later, when he would see that same flag again, not on a battlefield, but above a supermarket, he would finally understand why they had lost. He hadn't meant to come back. Not really. 2 decades had passed since the war, since the camp, since the day he'd bowed his head while the American anthem played. Saito was older now, a quiet man with graying hair and a limp he rarely explained. He'd come to America as a guest this time, invited by a veterans exchange program, and one afternoon, as the group toured a small town in Oregon, he wandered off alone. He stopped in front of a glass building with sliding doors that whispered open as he approached. The air inside hit him like déjà vu, cold, clean, humming with light. Rows upon rows of food stretched beyond sight. Aisles glittered with cans, fruit piled high, meat wrapped in perfect symmetry. Children laughed as they pointed at cereal boxes. Mothers compared prices under the soft buzz of fluorescent lamps. A supermarket. He gripped the handle of a shopping cart and stood still, eyes wide. A young clerk passed by, smiling politely. "Good afternoon, sir." He couldn't answer. His throat had closed. The last time he'd stood in a place like this, he'd been a prisoner of war, too afraid to believe such abundance was real. Now it surrounded him again, unchanged, unending. A woman lifted her child into the cart, dropped in milk, bread, and a box of cookies. Saito watched, heart pounding. In his youth, those items could have fed an entire village. Here, they were afterthoughts. He looked up at the lights, the ceiling fans, the refrigerated aisles whispering with cold air, and he finally understood. America hadn't won because of bombs or machines. It had won because it had learned to make enough. He thought of Tanabe, of the letter never sent, of the laughter of children behind a fence. And standing there between the aisles of abundance, he whispered in English, "This is why we lost." But even as he said it, he smiled, softly, almost gratefully. Because in losing, he had discovered what his country had never taught him. That peace, too, could be engineered. And years later, when he wrote his final journal entry, it ended with one line. "They conquered us not by force, but by plenty. And in that plenty, I found my freedom." He spent his last years by the sea, a small house on the coast of Yokosuka, where the wind smelled of salt and shipyards, where the horizon still shimmered with the ghosts of war. Saito rose early each morning, sweeping the porch, feeding stray cats that came for scraps of mackerel. On the shelf beside his bed sat an old tin box filled with mementos, a faded postcard of the Statue of Liberty, a broken watch given by an American guard, and a yellowed page, the letter he had never sent to Aiko. He would read it sometimes, not to mourn, but to remember who he used to be. On quiet afternoons, children from the neighborhood came by to listen. They called him Oji-san, the gentle old man who told stories of a war without hate. He would sit beneath the eaves, voice low, speaking of ships built in days, of bread that melted like clouds, of the strange kindness of enemies who had become teachers. One boy once asked, "Did they really forgive you?" Saito smiled. "They didn't have to. They just showed me a better way to live." When he grew too old to write, he began leaving notes inside the pages of his English books, small sentences that read more like prayers than lessons. Mercy is strength. Knowledge is light. Freedom begins when you stop fearing the other. The day he passed away, the sky above Yokosuka was unusually clear. In his room, the window stood open, curtains billowing softly. The tin box was left unlocked. Inside, the letter remained, unfolded for the first time in decades. At the bottom of the page, someone, perhaps Saito himself in his final days, had written a single English line, shaky but legible. "They defeated my body, but awakened my soul." When the sun set, the light touched the edges of that page, turning it gold for a moment before fading to gray. And somewhere across the ocean, in a quiet American town, a flag swayed gently above a supermarket entrance, unremarkable to everyone who passed by, except to those who still remembered. Because history isn't always written in blood. Sometimes it's written in mercy. And if this story changes how you see war, share it, not to glorify the past, but to remind someone, even in the ruins of defeat, humanity can still win.